Good morning. Well, actually, given that your day is so short, I don't know. Should I be saying good morning or good evening or good day? I don't know what the politically correct thing is. But I was marveling at this this morning because I arrived yesterday and it was light already. But then this morning, the sun never came up at all until 9. And I was like, okay, yesterday the sun went down at 4. Today it came up at 9. Do you not just have like the shortest working day ever? I mean, in winters I should move here so I can just sleep because I need to make up for 20 years of no sleep working in development in Africa. Good morning, everyone. Good day. My name is Namhla Mniki-Mangaliso. I dare you to pronounce that name and see how far you can go doing it. I am a South African, but really I am an African. And it's a singular pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful to Norad for the invitation. And I feel privileged standing in front of you because a lot of the times when we're talking about development, we create false chasms. And I think we've perpetrated for long enough the idea that there's the other in the room. And I think over years of working particularly on the SDGs, one actually realizes that we are by and large of the same heart and spirit because all of us are committed to this vision, this imagined reality that the world could in fact be a better place. And I think that by and large the people in this room also would say it's clear that if one part of the system doesn't work, we are all in trouble, regardless of which part of the world we are in. And so your 2015 experience is a really good example of that. In fact, I muse when civil society, I don't know how much civil society is in the room, I muse when civil society talks about disruption, and I'm like, come on, we've been dealing with disruption for decades now. Come to us and we can tell you how to deal with it. And so we are all on the same boat. And so I want to start off in that space and kind of say, I recognize and honor the fact that you have taken the time to consider this very important question, which is around how do we transform development assistance in this era of SDGs? What I want to do is looking at your performance, the Norwegian performance on ODA for the longest time. I mean, you've been heads and shoulders above most development organizations, or rather developed countries, particularly within the OECD. I think you're standing at about 1.12 of GNI now, which is excellent. Looking at your white paper just launched recently, again, it's clear that the principles are there, right? The foundation is there. So there's a strong understanding of a common global agenda. There's a strong understanding of the need for national ownership. There's a strong understanding of all of the key and core principles of the SDG agenda, leave no one behind, etc. And so I think that in a lot of these things, you have a lot of expertise. And what I wanted to do is to beg for your indulgence a little bit as I try and shed a light to, I think, a part of the system that is not often talked about, and that is the African people and the African condition. I'm going to shock you a little bit, and so prepare to be mentally disrupted, because I think that this is why forums like this exist. Because first of all, I'm going to show you that it is to be obsessive to assume that African governments are the start and end of solutions in the African context. And so I want to tell you about what's really happening in Africa, or what's beginning to happen, that makes me convinced that there are things we could do that could be creative, innovative, much more importantly, transformative, to actually usher in the kind of development that we want to see. Now, one of the first questions I was asked to answer is, are SDGs relevant in Africa? How is Africa responding to the SDG agenda? The very short answer to that is, I think by and large, African governments are taking the SDG agenda quite seriously. If you will recall, any of you who know about Agenda 2063, when Agenda 2063 was being finalized, it was then called the Common Africa Position. And in fact, it became the key negotiating document for the SDGs. And what has happened since September 2015 is that quite a number of the more strong governments in Africa have actually taken the initiative towards integration. And so Ghana, Uganda, one of those countries that started right at the beginning, within the first few months of the SDGs being adopted in New York, who said, well, we've actually done a mapping analysis to look at our NDP and to see the extent to which it aligns to the SDGs. We're going to spend the next year actually making sure that the NDP realigns. My own country in South Africa just recently published a document. Yes, it was 2 years late, and we've been working with South Africa for a very long time, trying to get them to show some political will and energy around the SDGs. But now they've published this report that talks about the alignment between our own NDP, the National Development Plan, with the SDGs, and talking about the fact that I think we meet about 76% of the indicators, and actually talking amongst themselves about how to meet the rest of the deficit, as it were. And so there are really some good trends there that are beginning to emerge. I think we all know that, though, once you start having things in paper is not always a guarantee that action is going to take place. And in fact, the very nature of my conversation here is about how do we move a vision to action. So I said I'm going to share or shed the light in a few spaces that I think are not often seen within the African continent. And while the one thing that I wanted to start off with is talk about some of the trends that I see emerging out of the African continent that are not often talked about. You'll be familiar with WEF's announcement in 2015 that identified, I think, 10 emerging African trends. These are not that, because I work with grassroots communities and I work with youth movements, and I'm going to tell you about what's going on amongst them. But let me start with a very, very short story. As African Monitor, one of the things that we've been doing is to build the capacity for citizen agency in the African continent. One of our projects, which then was called Voice Africa's Future, actually identified champions in 10 African countries. And these were youth champions, average age 22. And we wanted to build their capacity to influence their governments before governments go and negotiate in New York. So, Home, before they got to you, what we tried to do was to make sure that we are interacting with planning ministries, but particularly with ministries of international relations, to make sure that the positions that they took to the negotiations are actually informed by the aspirations of young people in the African continent. At the beginning of this year, very briefly, because I do not have a lot of time to share this, by and large, it was a fairly successful project. But at the beginning of this year, one of our champions, whom we found as our partner in Ghana, and when we found him, he had just finished university and he had started an organization working on development issues in a part of Ghana. And he comes to us, his organization having grown a little bit, and he comes to us as African Monitor and he says, at the end of this year, I'm going to bring together young people from across the African continent so that we can have a youth summit on the SDGs. Because I think that this question of agency on the SDGs is important. Now, he comes to us, an organization that has no resource capacity whatsoever to support any big vision like this. And when I heard it, and I amused myself to be fairly like outside the box, as it were. But myself, I was quite astounded by this big mission. You want a Pan-African summit on youth and SDGs? Fast forward November 1st, as I landed in Ghana, Accra, for the keynote address, and in the room were 450 young Africans from 27 countries, all of whom wanted to talk about their role in the SDGs. As I interacted with each of these young people, or most of these young people, over the next 3 days, I found out that most of them were either in university or had just concluded university. I found that they had a really strong commitment to seeing Africa evolve into a new type of Africa, as it were. And the trends that I'm going to talk about link very much to the story, because for me, the 3 days I spent in that room was a real affirmation of things that I've known all along, and I've been learning as I've been watching the wisdom of African people and realizing that there's a lot more here we don't see than we've been talking about. The first one is this idea of a re-emergence of the Pan-African agenda. Now, the Pan-African agenda you know of is probably the political agenda, right? And so you hear the African Union talking about Agenda 2063. In fact, the recent conversation now between the president of Ghana and the French president was a very good example of that, where African governments are saying ownership to Africa. They are saying we want policy-making space. In fact, we are taking back our policy-making space, and we're taking responsibility for generating resources for our own development and the whole thing around industrialization, etc. That's the political agenda. What we don't talk enough about is the fire that's emerging amongst ordinary Africans who are not only gaining confidence in their own ability to solve their problems as individuals, but also are gaining a sense of responsibility around what it is they need to do amongst their communities. One of the young men I talked to in this Ghana conference was a 23-year-old engineering student who was just about to graduate. And he says he started a CSI project for himself and his friends because he met and engaged with a community or a group of people who were coming from the disabled community. And that project now is growing to such an extent that they are having to think about establishing an actual organization while he does his engineering work on the side. That's the kind of Africa that I am talking about, where people are saying, we actually have the capability, but also we have the responsibility to start giving back. Now, if you are of the old ODA, let's call it aid paradigm, which is imagining an African that's sitting in a corner somewhere, impoverished, in deep pain, and quite sad. What you are missing is that, in fact, that's your own old ideas about who Africa is. If you're going to position yourself as helpful friends, let's call it, to this emerging agenda going forward, you have to learn the art of seeing this emerging Africa, which in many ways has always been there. I talk to people all the time and I say, I didn't grow up in South Africa in a very rich environment myself. In fact, I grew up in one of the Bantustans because I grew up in apartheid South Africa, where being a woman and black African was basically meant that I was no citizen at all. In fact, I was nothing in front of the law. But I don't remember impoverishment in my growing up because, in fact, agency was the essence of my community. And what we are beginning to see is that agency that is beginning to happen again. So then the question becomes, how does the development community position itself, not only to see, but to respect and leverage that which is emerging, so that it is those Africans that are strengthened as catalysts to actually address poverty problems in Africa? I'm going to make the case that looking at poverty in Africa through a poverty lens is problematic and self-defeating. Because, in fact, you need other types of seeing that are going to allow you to do things that are going to be creative, innovative, but also transformative, as it were. Are we together? How many of you think I'm a dreaming idealist? I've been told, by the way, in forums I've spoken to, that, yeah, I am. Africa's new tribe. I've already spoken about this trend that's emerging. The Africa Development Bank talks a lot about the demographic dividend. I think that people who are critical ask the questions around, are you not being unrealistic about this demographic dividend? Because, in fact, by and large, a large number of the 70% of the population that's under the age of 35 are disenfranchised, right? And so they're dropping out of school. Those who manage to get into primary education, there's huge dropout rates by the time you get to the end of the schooling career. Those who manage to get into universities, again, another huge dropout rate through the tertiary system. And so there are real meaningful questions that are being asked about how can we catalyze on this demographic dividend. What we don't talk about enough is what's happening to the ones that are managing to get through the tertiary system. The UK recently published a report saying that international students in their universities from Ghana and Nigeria have just doubled. And in fact, part of that data is saying that now international students studying in the UK from Nigeria are the largest number and have just surpassed students from India. Now, if you have concerns around migration and so on, this is a scary thought for you. It's not a scary thought at all for me, because what I am thinking is the engineering capacity that's going to emerge out of the people that are going through those education systems. I'm thinking about the IT capacities, and I'm thinking about the education capacities, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, international migration within the African continent, 50% of tertiary students are actually trained in South Africa, according to recent data. There's also some training that's happening in Ghana and other parts of Africa. What's exciting to me is the tripling of the volume of students, young people that are emerging out of the tertiary system with impressive skills. The question then becomes, is it your role sitting here in Norway to try and figure out how to fix African problems? Or is the role to support these amazing young Africans emerging out of tertiary institutions to be better at fixing their own problems there? Which means we're talking about a paradigm of capability. What do we need to do to invest in systems that allow for opportunities for emerging young energy to actually effectively engage and to be catalysts of their own development? And so I appreciated, I think, some of the comments that were being made a little bit earlier on, I think by you, and around the work that you're doing in Africa and some of the self-reflection, which I think is absolutely critical. But the question is not, how do you build the capacity of young girls in Africa? The question is, how do you strengthen Femnet, who's already your partner, to do it, and to do it well? Because Femnet is in a better position to do it. By the way, also Femnet is better recognized in those spaces, and therefore has better social legitimacy and ability to improve on social cohesion. So, there's a new game in town. I think that's the thesis that I'm putting forward. And the new game in town is changing what we understand by the resources that Africa has at its disposal to actually catalyze its own development. Looking at data around emerging high net worth individuals, Africa has the fastest growing number of billionaires. I mean, can you imagine that? The growth is about 145% now. I think a recent study about a year ago sort of touted. But it's not that the billionaires, the dollar billionaires are growing that's important. It's that the dollar billionaires actually understand what it is they need to be doing and are actually starting to work outside the government system to create ways to strengthen Africa and improve its productivity. Let's take Tony Elemelu as an example, who 2 years ago launches a $100 million fund to build high-functioning entrepreneurs in Africa, 10,000 of them in 10 years, who have the task of producing 1 million jobs and add $2 billion into African economies. I'd rather create a lot more Tonys than try and figure out how to distribute food parcels. Does that make sense? Africa's disruption, that's another area that I think is worth our attention. And this is the third trend, and then I'm going to move forward. I've watched a couple of things that have been happening within the African context. And I try and make sense of this by saying there's an extent to which Africans are creating parallel systems of operating in spite of and despite their governments. And there are numerous examples of where this is happening. And so one example is this example I've just made now about what high net worth individuals are doing. Other examples are just ordinary things that ordinary Africans are doing. And so, for instance, this beautiful piece that you see in my neck, I can actually buy it through Instagram because there's an Instagram market for beads in South Africa. And the market is so big that they don't have to find shops in order to be able to sell their product because they've just found a way of actually sidelining the system so that they can find their consumers directly on Instagram and sometimes on Facebook. It's not just the bidding market. Consumers are finding natural products for their hair within social media. There is a whole industry around fashion that's developing in Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa. All of them don't have physical existence, but they exist because they are finding their clients and their consumers online. If you're someone that is trying to find ways of supporting development in the African context, you are going to be looking for a business plan. You're going to be looking for a board of directors. You're going to be looking for financial statements audited for the last 5 years. You're not going to see these guys that are beginning to transform the way things are functioning because you're going to be looking using indicators that worked maybe back then but are going to be irrelevant going forward. It takes a minute just to look into what some of the people, for instance, WEF talks about the fourth industrial revolution, and they talk about the power of digitization and what it's going to do. And my question is, are you seeing some of those roots forming within the African context? And how young Africans are going to leverage that so that in 15 years, we look very different from what we look like now. I'm spending a lot of time talking to you about this new emerging Africa because I really want you to see it. And I really want you to figure out how do you then position yourselves as catalysts that strengthen the environment within which this emerging Africa exists. Because I think that that could be the most sacred role of ODA, particularly from progressive countries like Norway. So how do we shift gears? I'm going to highlight 3 things. I don't know how I'm doing with time, because I feel like I've been talking for a very long time. There's a thing? Okay. I still don't know, but I'm going to be quick because I don't see what I'm... I'm sorry. 3 suggestions, which I offer humbly. The first is agency. Everything, 0 time? Wow. Okay. I'm so sorry. Okay, so 3 things. Agency is the most critical thing that we could invest in. Agency in terms of governments, that they become the owners of their own development, but much more importantly, agency of the African people. I think that enough of this principle has been planted already in the very effective presentations that were made earlier on. I think that agency essentially implies that we have to put people at the center, and we always have to ask the question, how do we build the capability of individuals to function so that they can change their own environments? We at African Monitor believe that our work through the Citizens Report, our work through citizens-driven data on the SDGs, monitoring the SDGs, is some of the critical tools that we are going to make sure we can leverage so that we can hold African governments accountable. The second one is innovation, and I'm sorry I can't get into the detail of all of this stuff. But one of the things that worries me greatly is when we talk about the power of innovation, particularly in the context of disruption and chaos and uncertainty, is that we think about innovation as innovation within the small confines of universities and research entities and elite spaces, as it were. And the kind of innovation that fascinates me is the innovation that's happening in a rural town in Iduga, where I grew up, where people are finding local solutions that actually work for local context. The third one is collaboration and co-creation. I think that enough has been said about the fact that none of us can get to where we need to get to on our own. In my opening remarks, I said, if we understand that we are like-minded and we are of the same idea and we want the same outcomes, then the job becomes, how do we get better at being able to see each other, to listen to each other, and to respect the value that we all bring to the system. A group of southern and northern civil society organizations got together to develop what we are now calling the vision for transformative partnerships, where trust, dignity, respect are the essence of the principles that we must promote so that northern civil society can work in harmony with southern civil society. The bottom line is this. We have two choices. The one choice is to comfortably believe that Africa is a basket case, in which case we need to help it, and find some of the things that I'm talking about difficult. And somebody talks about the cycle of disbelief when you talk about new emerging trends that have not been seen before. And so that's the one option, is to be locked in that cycle of disbelief. The other option is to say, maybe something is beginning to emerge here. Let's take a little bit of a closer look, and let's figure out how we can learn to be audacious enough to take the risk of leveraging these new spaces and get moving and address these critical problems around poverty, inequality, and sustainability, as it were. Thank you very much.